Hello, friends. Welcome to the ATC Double Cut. I am back with Chris Tritabaugh, the golf course superintendent from Hazeltine National Golf Club. And Chris, you've been on the show a number of times now. I'm losing track.
Yeah, I don't know if I have track of how many times. I'm sort of like the Don Rickles. Like Don Rickles was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson over 100 times, I think. And I guess I'm sort of like Don Rickles to your Johnny Carson.
Yeah, we're getting there because you've been on here on the ATC Double Cut, where we go over some of the ATC blog posts and give them give them a double cut treatment, and then you've also been on the office hours, which we generally do as a live stream. You've been on that a few times also. So yeah, welcome back. I'm so glad that we have a chance to talk about something that's related to what we always seem to be talking about, which is managing high performance putting surfaces, especially.
Well, it's a great topic, and something you and I are both really passionate about, and we spend a lot of time talking about on the side, and I think it's an interesting topic and one worth discussing. So,
and this one, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the blog post, which you'll find at asianturfgrass.com. It's a recent blog post that I wrote last week, and it has the title, I was surprised to read this about nitrogen, coring, and sand top dressing. And this is a post that I wrote last week, and it starts off with something very straightforward. It's a quote from a book, actually from this book, the fourth edition of the Compendium of Turfgrass Diseases, which is a book that I think is superb. It lists all the turfgrass diseases, and it's divided into sections, which I wrote about in the blog post. For each disease, there are sections such as symptoms and signs, causal agents, disease cycle, epidemiology, management of the disease, and then selected references. And I bought this book almost a year ago, and the shipping to Thailand was well over $100. And I said, I'm not going to pay more for shipping than I'm going to pay for the book. So I left it. I had it shipped to a relative's in the United States, and then on a recent trip to North America, my brother came over to Victoria, British Columbia, and he had this book with him. My aunt had transferred it to my brother, and then my brother flew over with it to Victoria, and I was able to get it, and it was still in its packaging, and I brought it back to Thailand and opened it, and I flipped it open, and Chris, I was surprised. I was really surprised at what I read, because the book has a publication date of 2023. And yet what I read,
it's a recent publication.
It's right, because I've got here this is the third edition, the Compendium of Turfgrass Diseases, third edition, which I've had for many years. This one was published in third edition is 2005. So it was time for an update. There's been all kinds of research and developments and new disease names and all kinds of stuff that's happened since 2005. So this one, the fourth edition, I was so glad to read it and to have it. And everything's updated. And yet it's recent. It's published in 2013. And I was surprised to read in 2023. And I'll just ask you before I read the quote from the blog post, Chris, how much nitrogen did you apply on creeping bentgrass putting greens last year?
I think we were just under 3/4 of a pound for the year on the greens.
So that's not very much. That's something
not
like
very much.
That's like 35 kilograms per hectare, 3.5 grams. 40 kilograms per hectare, something like that. It's not a huge amount, and yet I was reading and I just flipped open. It's not like I was searching for anything. I was just like, let me see what's in this book. I flipped it open. I happened to be on the section on Pythium root dysfunction, and I went to management, and maybe my eyes were caught or attracted by seeing that it was about fertilizer and sand. And here's the quote from the book. creeping bentgrass should be fertilized with 4 to 6 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet annually. That's 195 to 292 kilograms per hectare. And then it went on in that same management section for this disease to say frequent cultivation. Cultivation means like aerification or coring, anything that's breaking into the soil. It says frequent cultivation and top dressing are necessary, are needed. In general, 15 to 20% of the putting green surface area should be impacted by hollow tine aerification annually, and 5,000 pounds, which is more than 2,000 kilograms or 2 tons of sand. 5,000 pounds of top dressing should be applied per 1,000 square feet each year. And that works out to be more than 15 millimeters of depth of sand. And
I was
so,
going to ask if you knew the millimeters, which of course you do, because you really do. But that's a lot.
it's a lot. And yet, so the part that surprised me was not so much that was recommended. It was that it was recommended in a book that was published in 2023, because I used to recommend nitrogen rates that were approaching that amount, not quite that high, but I would have recommended 3 pounds or 150 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, thinking that that would be a reasonable amount. And I definitely used to recommend that much coring, and I used to recommend that much sand top dressing, but I stopped doing that about almost 10 years ago. And I was just surprised to see how persistent these standard recommendations are in the golf course, putting green, turf grass management industry. And I don't know if you read that, would you be surprised as a golf course superintendent to be getting recommendations for that much N and for that much sand and for that much core cultivation?
Yeah, that seems like an awful lot. And of course, the context that I have at this moment is that I would apply and have applied much less than that. But it still seems like an awful lot. Like when I go back to my days as an assistant, I think about the amount of nitrogen we'd put on a bentgrass fairway in the summer, and it was maybe somewhere in that realm. But that was almost 20 years ago that we were doing that, and I don't know anybody nowadays who really does it. So, two questions I would ask is, how many people are doing those amounts? And, the answer would probably be not that many, but also it's strange that a book like that is making such, what would be the word? Rote? Would rote be a good word in this case? Recommendations on management of creeping bentgrass when, it just seems like it's different in these days. And certainly that's not even getting into the context of what we're doing, which is substantially different than those numbers.
And that's kind of how the blog post moved along, because as that blog post moved along, I kind of explained why that was what I was writing about this week in the blog post, because you and I have had a long running conversation about this. John Kaminski's been involved, and it's just interesting. So let's go back to that blog post and see. Let's see. Can I bring that up? There we go. If we go back to that blog post, we'll get into that about how what you're doing is different than this. So basically, I think it's better to do a site-specific optimization, right? To try to figure out how much nitrogen you should apply to produce good turf grass conditions at your site, and you should adjust the core cultivation and you should adjust the sand top dressing to figure out how much is necessary so that you can maximize the number of days in the year with playing conditions at the desired level for a particular property. And I put a picture in there and I put this caption. I said, it takes a lot of applications through the year to apply 5,000 pounds of sand per 1,000 square feet. And it sure does. When you start,
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to write these numbers in a book. It's easy to make these recommendations as a consultant. It's easy to stand up in a seminar and teach this kind of stuff. And I used to do that. I used to make these recommendations as a consultant, and I used to teach seminars about organic matter management and say that you need to remove all the old material by coring, 15 or 20% per year. If you do 20% per year, I used to say that works really good because over 5 years, you essentially completely rejuvenate, you completely replace your upper part of the profile because you're taking out the old material 20% per year and you're replacing it with clean sand. So over 5 years, you're essentially rejuvenating it. And I used to make those recommendations. I used to make the recommendations for all this sand. It's easy to make those recommendations. It's hard to do because when you start doing the math, you realize, how can I punch that many holes and not destroy the greens for a huge portion of the year? And how can you put that much sand without disturbing the surfaces constantly? And it turns out I don't think you can. And that's why I was surprised to see that standard recommendation. You said it's a rote recommendation. And that's I feel like there's another word. It's just so general because bent grass that's being grown in Augusta, Georgia, and bent grass that's being grown in Montreal, and bent grass that's being grown in London, England, and bent grass that's grown in Moscow, Russia, and bent grass that's growing in Canberra, Australia. It should be different. So to make these species specific recommendations, I don't think that's the modern way to do it because so many people are collecting data now about how much their grass is growing, and it just seems that we should be more site specific these days. So I kind of concluded that section. I concluded that section of the blog post, and I said the question, of course, is whether that alternative method, the site-specific method, works. And basically I said, should a turf manager listen to the books or listen to me? That's what I concluded that section with.
Well, I have a good story that sort of along these lines. So let me go back pre data collection from my standpoint. So that it doesn't go back very far. That goes back to 2016, which is the year we hosted the Ryder Cup. And I recall being a little bit unhappy with the greens and a little bit unhappy with that they were when they would be wet or when we would have had a rainy period. And I thought to myself, oh, that's nice to get definitely you're in the morning here, so you're still working that. I would imagine it takes a couple of hours each day to work that mustache into prime condition.
Yeah.
Right?
So for those of you listening and not watching, you'll see I'm just adjusting the mustache curl because just with the way the light, I think it looks good in person, but with the way the light's shining on the camera, it looks like there's a couple loose hairs there.
And so, by the way, in 2016, when you came over for the Ryder Cup, you had a fine mustache going for that period. It was.
I had been in Catalonia in the spring of 2016, and I had been to a place where Salvador Dali had done a lot of work and had a home, and it was mentioned to me while there that's like, Micah, maybe you could do a mustache like that. And I thought, maybe I could. And so I set out to try to achieve that. And I think by the Ryder Cup, it was in pretty good shape.
It was in very good shape, as I recall. It was quite the it was very nice. So yeah.
Okay. So back to your story and
story.
getting out the sand, right?
Yeah. So in 2016, so I'm not quite happy with the surfaces, and I think the way to solve this is to get as much sand on these greens between now and the time we host the event in September. and it worked. The greens were very good. But what happened? Okay, so a person might say, well, that's great. You got your results, so it worked, and that's justification for having done what you did. However, what I would say is the impact it had on our membership was very negative, and people were not happy with the amount of sand that was on the grid. We're not happy that during the course of the season, that was going to be the early part of the season, a season which was going to be very part as we got ready for the event. They were unhappy with the amount of sand on the greens, and they always putting through sand and feeling like that was always disrupting their round. And in fact, at the end of the year, our members have this party, and they kind of do a bit of a roast at the end of the year, and they find something that people have done during the year and a little bit roast worthy. And this particular year, 2016, they decided that my application of sand greens was worthy of a song. And the song, they had special words to the song, to the tune of Mr. Sandman. And so I became known as Mr. Sandman for a period of time around 2016. Now, again, this was pre-data. This was I wasn't collecting daily stimp meter. I wasn't collecting bobble test. I wasn't measuring sand. I wasn't measuring OM246. So at that time, I felt like the best thing I could do was to just put as much sand down as possible. And again, the results were very good. You were there, Micah. You saw them. The greens were great. So in sort of standard golf course maintenance way of thinking about things, a person would say, well, so what? You got your result. But the so what is that it was very disruptive to members. They were very unhappy with it. If we would have continued on that path for, if that we had always done from then until now, I don't know that I would still be as welcomed as in my job as I am today. So, it's just an example of, yes, that type of recommendation at some point in time is probably going to find you having an excellent surface. But I think we need to be thinking more about an excellent surface all the time rather than at just these, certain points of the year, high points of the year, I guess you might say. This happened the last time we did a podcast. Micah's computer has frozen. I got through my anecdote. I looked up. I was into telling my story, and I look up, and he's in the same pose as he was when I started telling my story. So I don't know when we lost him. I don't know if this will stay in the podcast, but he'll be back. He's going to restart, potentially retool, and he will come back online, and we'll pick up from where we left off. I hope everybody's enjoying the soft lighting that I have here coming from my right-hand side. It's evening here in Minnesota. Usually when we do these podcasts together, it's the opposite. I'm in the morning in my office. Mike is winding down his day, but tonight it worked for us to do it opposite.
Well, I am back, Chris. Thanks for putting up with the crash again.
Well, I'm happy to fill in and do a little bit of riffing, I guess, anytime, Micah. So
So, did you finish your story about the
I did.
amount of
I
sand
did
that
finish
you put?
my story. I had no idea where you left off. I finished my story. So if you've gone back and edited this, you can listen to the end of the story, cut the crash out, and then pick up once you're back in.
Okay.
Back online.
Well, I will see how we handle that.
Okay.
So now for some backstory about this blog post. I wrote the first part just saying I was so surprised to read those recommendations in a book that was published in 2023, because although those type of recommendations to me seem they're the same as the recommendations that I used to make, I don't know that I definitely don't make those recommendations today. And as part of not making those recommendations today, I write and talk about this quite a bit with people that I meet or on the ATC website or so on. And there's that famous conversation that we had with John Kaminski at the Masters tournament, and it was about you, Chris. So I wanted to have you on this episode also, because you wrote on your Substack. I'll put a direct link to the Substack, to your Substack. In fact, there's a link in this blog post. You said, you gave it a title, "At what point can we say this works?" And this is something of like, you've been doing something different than what's in the book. So the book says, if you want good bent grass, if you want to prevent Pythium root dysfunction, if you want to have greens that are firm enough, you need to do this, this, and this. You need to put this much N, you need to do this much cultivation, you need to put this much top dressing. You've been doing quite different than that for a number of years. And then people say, well, that could only work for a short time. It can't work forever. And then you put the post and you said, at what point can we say this works? And this is because it goes back to that conversation that we had with Dr. Kaminski, where we asked him, what do you think about managing turf without doing this constant in-season addition of sand to bent grass? And he said, well, it might work for one season, it won't work forever. So then I've listed in the blog post a number of things related to this, which include your blog post or your Substack post, when can we say this works? And then there was an excellent Talking Greenkeeper podcast with John Kaminski as a guest, talking to the host, Joe Galati. And Joe started off that episode by asking him, hey, what's this all about? What was that conversation? And John gave a lengthy answer that I thought was a little bit sliding beside the actual point, not really addressing exactly what that conversation was about. But I'll give him some credit for him saying he doesn't remember the conversation. And then I talked with Joe Galati, and he gave me a chance to talk for 10 minutes or so, kind of explaining my side of it. So I think there's all kinds of backstory to this. And the reason why we keep talking about it again and again is not because we're trying to show that John Kaminski is wrong. We're not trying to have an argument with him or something. It's because we think that this is such an exciting opportunity for turfgrass managers to have better turfgrass conditions. And the problem is it goes against what's in the textbooks. And that's kind of, I think for me, why we want to, or why I just keep talking about it again and again.
Well, and I think we've covered it in this way. I always try to think of a new way to explain to people why this is such a good thing. And first of all, let me say, I feel like I got to stick up for myself a little bit. Again, John's we both know John well, and a lot of this is good natured. There's certainly, although a rivalry certainly sells, airtime. We have good natured conversations with John, and he's a good friend of both of ours. But what I do want to stick up myself a little bit, and maybe I have written that we don't airify, we don't top dress, but I don't think that that's what I've written, because I tend to try to write the truth about things, and I would know that saying that we aren't doing these things would not be truth. And so that wouldn't be my intent, to try to write and say we don't top dress anymore, we don't airify anymore, because that's certainly not the case. We have done both, and we do both. But I also know, and this from speaking with colleagues and from just paying attention to the industry, that there are many superintendents who wonder how they can find enough time to do the type of work that they need to do. And that becomes either a complaint or it becomes a concern. Staffing is tight. Lots of people are playing golf. Post-pandemic, golf is very popular, and some places are as busy as they've ever been, or more busy than they've ever been. And so I know for some people and some of my counterparts and colleagues, they are finding it difficult to find the time to do these types of things. So I think what you and I are trying to say, Mike, is if you can collect the data, if you can really assess your situation, if you can pay attention to your playing conditions, you can probably do a lot less of these things that you think you have to do than you feel you need to do, and that will give you time to do other things. It will give you, it will give you opportunities, and just basically like you can stop worrying about how do I get 15 millimeters of sand out during the course of a season, because that's a lot of sand. 15 millimeters is a centimeter and a half. That's that would that be somewhere near 2/3 of an inch?
It's yeah, it's something near that. It's something
That's a
near that.
lot of sand. That's
Yeah,
a lot of sand.
18 millimeters would be 3/4 of an inch, I think. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's
So
getting there.
I think that's it. And that's what we're trying to convey, is that you can have excellent playing surfaces with a lot less than what is the usual recommendation that is being made. And that's the point we're trying to get across. Certainly not that you can stop doing any of these
Right.
things.
And
That's not
and
it.
that's why it was both I was so glad when Joe, in his Talking Greenkeeper podcast, when he had John as the guest and he started off with that question. I was so glad that they had that topic, and John agreed with so much of this. He said that
Yep.
he really supports what you're doing. He supports my way of thinking about this, and he said that's what he tries to teach. He said that's what Penn State tries to teach, is to look at data, make decisions based on your site, and so on. So much of the stuff that John said was very complimentary, and he's in agreement with us, but he kept seeming to suggest that you were trying to claim that you're doing great greens without sand and you're doing great greens without coring. And he went through and took the time to look at our office hours conversation from last autumn. And he said, but wait, Chris showed a picture that showed he's got holes in the green and he's putting a lot of sand. And when he talked about what he did year after year, he was putting sand and he was punching holes almost every year. So maybe what he's doing is not that far out of the ordinary. That's what John was trying to suggest. And he was like saying what Chris is doing is not so far out of the ordinary, and yet I support the idea, but don't think that what he's doing is so different. But I think it's important to point out that what you're doing is appreciably different from what we find in this book, the Compendium of Turfgrass Diseases, 4th edition. And in fact, I've got another book that I took off my shelf, which John's a co-author on, the Turfgrass Management, Turgeon and Kaminski. And I opened to the section on sand top dressing, and I confirmed that what this book is recommending also. In fact, I'll read that, and it says, okay, the total amount of sand used during a growing season as top dressing applied to the surface and to fill the holes resulting from hollow tine cultivation should be at least 12 to 15 millimeters. Okay, so it's in this book too. This book was published in this is an autographed copy. Thank you, John, if you're listening. This is 2019. So I just want to say from my side that I'm familiar with what these standard recommendations are, and Dr. Kaminski is familiar with what these standard recommendations are, and the quantities of sand and the quantities of cultivation that you're doing is a fraction of this. So even though you're still doing it, you're doing a fraction of what's being recommended. And I think that's important to point out, because otherwise everybody feels guilty. They would feel guilty that they're not doing what they've been taught. They're not doing what they think they're supposed to do.
Well, I mean, just another anecdote, and this comes from an interaction you and I had back in, I think, 2014 or 2015, and this has nothing to do with sand, but this was potassium. And at that time, I was sort of, working from a recommendation that had been given to me by a consultant, and I was applying a lot of potassium, and I was applying a certain, trying to get a pound of potassium out every time we got a 1 inch rainfall, something like that. And I remember it was like chasing our tail because in Minnesota, it can oftentimes rain more than an inch quite often in the summer. Uh, a thunderstorm comes and it would be put an inch out, and then, 2 days later, get another inch, and now you got to put another one out. You're trying to keep up with these amounts. And that to me, that experience and that memory of doing that to me reminds me much of this, this idea of get that much sand out there. You just feel like you can't catch up. You don't have enough time to do it. You're trying to split the difference between, let me get a big amount out so I can get to my total that I want, or let me put out an amount that's small enough for, so that the golfers won't recognize it. So you're always trying to like thread this needle of just enough to, enough to do that's something that's going to make a difference for our totals, and not enough that the golfers are really going to be affected by it. So, you know, what I'm trying to say, what we're trying to say is, hey, it is possible to have really great kids without having to thread that needle. Put it down once a year, twice a year, 3 times a year, whatever that number had, but it doesn't need to be every week. It doesn't need to be every other week, and you can have great greens. So,
Yeah, and just to put the numbers in context, so that turfgrass management book is recommending 12 to 15 millimeters of sand, and you for the past few years have been applying in the range of 3 to 4 millimeters of sand.
right.
So you're basically
Quarter to a third.
basically you're applying 20 or 25% of the recommended amount.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for any facility, maybe they can get away with applying 10% of the recommended amount. Maybe they need to apply 150% of the recommended amount. And that's where John was saying, by taking these measurements and by making decisions based on how the turf and soil is performing at your location and what the playability is at your location, you're able to find out how much you should be putting at your place. But I think because the standard recommendations are so high, and in turfgrass, a lot of things, the recommendations have been so high. You brought up the idea of potassium recommendations being so high.
Yep.
I'm going to recommend MLSN, the minimum levels for sustainable nutrition, as a way to get away from those outrageously high recommendations where the soil can't even hold that many nutrients. And I call MLSN a modern method for turfgrass soil test interpretation because it's based on preventing nutrient deficiencies, but not on trying to build up the soil to levels that the soil can't possibly hold. Anyway, there's recommendations for things in turfgrass that just persist, right? So there's those high nutrient levels. There's the relatively high nitrogen that was in that turfgrass disease book, that recommendation. And then these high amounts of sand and coring that it's based on research that was done 20 plus years ago. It's not the way grass needs to be managed today. And that's why I just keep stressing it that be aware that maybe the textbooks are wrong sometimes. And the only way to tell if the textbook is wrong is you have to observe carefully the grass at your location, let your grass talk to you, and then for you to understand the grass, because grass doesn't talk, but the numbers talk. The clipping volume, how much the grass is growing, that talks. The change in soil nutrient levels, that talks to you. The playability, the green speed, the bobble test, that's a way that the grass can talk to you if you're listening. The only way for you to listen is to collect those data. And I think I'm just so excited about this as a nice, logical, fun way to manage turfgrass, and to still use the fundamentals that come from the textbooks, the fundamental standard recommendations, use that as a starting point and then adjust it based on how we need to produce the surfaces at our places.
Yeah, I mean, I think you used a great word, which is fun. I mean, to me, this is a really fun way to do it, and I'm not doing it because it's fun. I'm doing it because it's producing great results, and of course, it's fun to have your golfers come back and say, "Wow, the results are, what we're experiencing every day from the day we open to the day we close is just wonderful." That's a lot of fun, but it's a lot of to collect this information, to put it into, a spreadsheet and look at a chart and to then make decisions based on that chart and it's to find out that you can manage really great greens with 7/10 of a pound or 3/4 of a pound of nitrogen per year when in the past you've used 2. I mean, those are that's not budget breaking numbers. People know that's a small amount of nitrogen on relatively small area. That's not going to make or break somebody's budget, but it it's nice to do the least amount possible to get the best possible conditions, is the way I like to think about it.
Yeah, that allows you to use the resources effectively. In the most recent episode, I was talking with a golf course superintendent from Hersala Golf in Finland. His name is Janne Leto. And he mentioned that, well, I mean, we were talking about robotic auto mowers that now they have an entire fleet for fairways, and 75% of the rough is mown with those mowers. And he talked about how they improve the turf conditions. And it wasn't only that the auto mowers themselves, through their clean cut and kind of constantly keeping the grass at the same height, has led to improved. They said the fairway conditions are the same as when they were cutting with real mowers 2 or 3 times a week, and the rough conditions are considerably better because there's less grass clippings. Basically, there were grass clippings in the rough before, now there are none, and the rough is just so consistent, and there's improved density of the primarily Poa pratensis rough. But he said it's not just that it's improved turf conditions, that it frees up the staff to now they can go do verticutting more. They can go detail the bunkers more. They can do all kinds of work because they're reallocating those resources. And I always feel like, why do I need to explain something so obvious that spending less money in one area or doing less work in one area is not about doing less work. It's not about reducing the amount of money you spend. It's about being efficient so that you can then buy more wetting agent or make more frequent soil surfactant applications. I should substitute soil surfactant instead of wetting agent to be more accurate. Or maybe, I mean, there's so many things that can be done, whether it is labor reallocation, allocation of working hours, or things that will have an impact on improving turf quality that you can spend money on. So I think that's kind of obvious, but some people seem to think, oh, that's how it works. So I will mention that.
Yeah. I mean, you made a great point. I mean, we've both seen pictures of or videos of a Monday where somebody is verticutting, and it involves 3 or 4 people blowing afterwards, blowing the greens off and cleaning that all up. And at the same time, maybe it's not the same person, but generally in the industry, we're all talking about how much work bunkers are and how much time we have to spend in bunkers. That's certainly the case for us. Imagine if on a Monday you don't have to have 3 to 4 people blowing your verticutting mess off a green, and you can put detailing bunkers or something of that nature. You're right, Mike. I mean, it's pretty easy to think of ways to spend that money differently. And again, I don't think we're doing anything we both have been in situations where we had people come up to us and say, this is the way I've been managing for our numbers. And it's I'm yet to have somebody who tells me they're managing like that, and they say something like, but I'm really thinking about changing because it's really not working out that well for me. So there are people out there. I don't want to say that we're doing something that nobody's doing, or that isn't already happen. But I think it's just trying to help, those who maybe need a little push, or are or those who are already doing it and are interested in it and are interested in doing it better.
Yeah, and we just put like a framework to it. Like MLSN is so simple, and a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people, they're like, you know what? That's how I've been thinking about fertilization for my whole career. And I've
Mm-hmm.
heard this from professors also saying this is what I've been teaching for 20 or 30 years. Uh, and all MLSN did is just formalize a way
Mm-hmm.
to think about it and say, okay, here's some exact numbers that we're going to use to apply this approach, and here's the way that we think about it. Boom, and we'll give it a name. That's all
Mm-hmm.
that is. And clipping volume is the most simple thing possible. And is this something that's new? Of course not. I mean, there's the episode of Dave Wilbur's Turf Grass Zealot project where he was talking with another longtime superintendent, and they both said, this is nothing new. We've been checking the clippings, for decades. And that's
Mm-hmm.
true. Everybody does it, but to actually measure it, all this does is just formalizes just a little bit. It just takes one more step. It formalizes it to measure the number and then share that information and say, here's what seems to be normal. Here's the amount of growth that people are getting. So all of these things, like the stimp meter measurement, people have been doing that since the late 1970s. Bobble test, everybody, they're always like, well, I don't use the bobble test. I just hit a few putts and I watch the quality of the roll. Everybody's already doing all of these
Mm-hmm.
things, and it's not that we're doing anything that is so innovative. It's just
Mm-hmm.
we're in a position to talk about it. We're in a position to write about it. We enjoy writing and talking about this and trying to organize our thoughts. And for me, it's also because I used to make those recommendations myself. I used to say, you don't need to do the bobble test. You should put this much sand. You should put this many hollow tine holes. I said you don't need to measure the clippings. Should just put this much nitrogen based on growth potential or something. Based on temperatures at your site, just put the nitrogen by this schedule, and that will give you healthy grass. And because I've changed my thinking, and I found it helpful for me, I feel like it's my job to share that,
Mm-hmm.
or certainly something that I enjoy sharing.
Well,
And then
it's a good. Go ahead.
and I was just going to say, because those standard recommendations remain in the textbooks,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the standard recommendations remain in the disease books, uh, in the because what I'm recommending now is considerably different. So in your case, I use the number of 25%, 20 or 25%, where you're applying sand at a fraction of the rate. You're applying nitrogen at a fraction of the rate that's recommended, because what I'm recommending now is so different from what's in the textbooks. I also feel like there's a bit of a calling to put that difference out there. I
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure that people are clear about uh, what I'm recommending is a little bit different than what you find in the textbooks, which I'm still happy to buy those books. It's money well spent. I recommend that other people buy those books too, but keep up to date on what you really need to do at your facility.
Well, and I think along those same lines, my experience has been, which I shared with that story from 2016. My experience has been that I at one time was sort of doing it, maybe not those textbook recommended ways, but something closer to that. When again, I thought, just the more sand you put out, the better the greens are going to be, and we were getting we're getting negative feedback from that. We've changed. And the feedback has improved. I mean, that to me is, if nothing else, that's, you know, to get that consistent feedback of the greens are great every single day, um, is worth, that's worth exploring no matter what, no matter what uh, type of facility you're at. So,
Yeah, I'm about ready to close, and I'll just say one more anecdote along those lines. I've heard that from you for a couple of years now, is that you're telling me the member feedback that you've been getting has just been superb. And it's stuff like these greens are the best that they've ever been. The greens this season were the best of any season, and that kind of thing. And it's anecdote because the weather changes year by year, and golfer assessments of playability and course appearance may be affected by many things that are different from what the actual conditions are. And also the way that you manage the technology, the technology that you have available, the staff working ability as they get trained more, and then the staff are probably working better and better. The machinery is better and better. There's all kinds of things that could be affecting the conditions that are not related to the sand and the MLSN and all of that stuff. Okay, so I qualify these anecdotes by saying it may not be only because of these things. However, I hear that from you, and I've heard it from multiple golf course superintendents in multiple countries with multiple grass types and multiple climates. And it's also even to the point of this particular green is shaded in the wintertime. It typically doesn't get sun for 4 months. We've in the past had to close it and use a temporary green. However, after implementing these types of what I call the grammar of greenkeeping approach, which is all these things, measuring the growth rate and being conscientious about how much sand you're applying based on total organic material in the soil and stuff like that. So applying this grammar of greenkeeping approach, MLSN for nutrients and so on, and people are like, now we don't have to go on a temporary. This green, we always had to resod some of it in the spring. Now it's 100% grass cover. And the same recurring refrain coming from customers of these greens are the best that they've ever been. And that's all anecdote, but man, what an anecdote that is to hear. I mean, that's exactly what we want to hear as turfgrass managers, or in my case, as an advisor to many turfgrass managers.
Yeah. I mean, in the end, it's all about that end result. And again, we've said it over and over. You can get there by doing a lot or doing a little. And I guess I would always trend towards getting there by doing a little. So.
All right. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining me here on the ATC Double Cut. We've had you on so many shows, and you've often been on Office Hours. So I was going to say thanks for joining me on the Office Hours. This was the Double Cut. So thank you. Again, you've got your excellent Substack newsletter that I'm going to put a direct link to, and I suggest that people subscribe to that. You put good stuff out there. Anything else you want to recommend before we sign off?
No, I have a couple speaking events coming up. I will be at the Ontario Golf Superintendents Association show in Niagara Falls, talking about data collection and leadership and life balance talk. I'll be giving talks on the same two topics at the BTME in Harrogate in the week after that. The week after, I'm in Ontario, and then I'll be at the conference and trade show in Phoenix, giving talks on the same. So if you're going to be at those shows, I hope to catch up with you. And if you have a chance or the interest to take in any of those talks, I hope that you will.
Yeah, that's good. I am looking forward to that, and I won't be at any of those 3 events, but I hope that after you participate in them, you will maybe write about it on your Substack and maybe share. Yeah, I'm always intrigued by what questions people ask or what some of the discussions that happen live at these events, where we learn, even though there are prepared remarks, there's prepared slides and remarks that you want to convey, information that you want to get across. Much of the interest of getting together at these events is the things that you learn through the discussions. So I'm personally looking forward, even though I can't attend any of those, hearing about them and hearing what you learned.
Yeah, it might be fun to write a little bit about some of the commentary that I get from people. Either, hey, I've done this and it's I'm doing something similar and it's not working for me, or just some of the good questions that people ask, almost like an FAQ that comes from these talks. So, yeah, that maybe gave me an idea of something to do afterwards. So, something to think about. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate you joining the show, and I have a feeling that you'll be back before too long.
That's like Don Rickles. He was always they always knew he was going to be back. So I have a feeling I will be back again soon.
Good. All right. Well, thanks a lot, and we'll talk again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for listening. I'll sign off now. For ATC from Trong, I'm Michael Woods. Bye-bye.